My name is Ronnie Cummins, and I'm a co-founder and international director of Organic Consumers Association in the U.S. And along with my fellow panelist Andre Lowe from Australia, I'm one of the people who founded a network in 2014, 2015 called Regeneration International, which is a network of over 400 organizations and farms and ranches internationally in over 60 countries. And we are dedicated to bringing organic to the next stage, which is organic and regenerative. And we are quite convinced, as you will hear today, that regenerative and organic agriculture and food and land use really has the potential to solve, as Vandana Shiva, one of our steering committee members, points out, the crisis of the climate, the soil crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the economic crisis of rural farmers and herdspeople, and the political crisis. So we're really happy to be here today. Moses is the largest and, in my opinion, the most important network of organic farmers and organic advocates in the United States. We're really happy that Moses is leading the way to the next stage of organic, which will be regenerative as well as organic. So the panel today we're talking about may sound a little esoteric to people who are in the middle of the winter in the northern U.S., but it's important to see that according to the United Nations, 40% of the world's terrain, that's about 9 billion acres, is what's termed semi-arid or arid. That is, it's quite dry. It's threatened with becoming outright desert. Right now, in the semi-arid, arid areas of the world, which include the southwestern United States, farmers and ranchers and indigenous communities, rural communities are having a very difficult time. I mean, it was difficult enough already to farm in these areas, but with climate change, it's gotten even worse. I mean, if you get the amount of rain you're expecting in a year as a farmer or rancher, you're probably not going to get it at the times of the year that you used to. And for most of us, we've seen over the last few years, we're getting less rainfall. And when we get a rain, sometimes it's a downpour that does damage. And so what we're addressing here today is a type of agroforestry and holistic management of livestock system that has been developed in the semi-desert highlands of Mexico. A group of farmers in desperation about 10 years ago who were losing their land, watching their animals, not have enough to eat during the dry season, the 8 to 9 month dry season here. They came up with a revolutionary system that we believe can be a game changer for a huge portion of the world. This system uses keystone native species, agave plants, and nitrogen fixing trees. In our case here, it's mesquite trees, but it would be, prickly acacia in Africa and Lucania and other places. Andre will talk more about that. But the game-changing nature of this system in Mexico is that we never thought about fermenting food really for animals much before. It's a big trend in the organic and natural sector in the United States and Europe and Japan to eat fermented foods. And but we never thought about, well, what about fermenting some of these desert plants so that animals can eat them? Agaves they grow in about half of the areas of the earth that are semi-arid, arid, the 40% of the world. In other words, they're growing right now in 20% of the lands across the world. Places like South Africa, North Africa, Latin America, the dry zones of Central America, Mexico, the southwestern United States, India, China. They're all over the place. There's 140 to 200 varieties of agaves. Most of them were used, 100 years ago for textiles or for producing beverages like pulque or aguamiel, or modern days people are more familiar with tequila and mezcal. No one ever mastered the strategy of how do you feed the leaves or the pencas of these giant agave plants to animals, because they have compounds in them, saponins and lectins, that are really hard to digest. And yes, an animal will eat a chopped up agave stem if they're starving to death, but is it good for them? No, not if it's not fermented. And what these farmers developed about 10 years ago was a system for using, chopping up the agave leaves and fermenting them in a closed container and then feeding them to livestock. They're very nutritious. They're much cheaper than alfalfa or hay. They require no irrigation, no water. And if they're grown the way they should be in nature, in conjunction with nitrogen fixing, nutrient fixing trees, like in our area here in north central Mexico, mesquite, they can be a continuous system that will not drain the soil of nutrients. It'll actually improve the soil. So if you can imagine a landscape with the big agaves, but also where there is a significant proportion of trees and bushes in the landscape, where you can graze livestock holistically. We use solar fencing, movable solar fencing, and so on. Then you've got a picture of how we can green the desert and sequester incredible amounts of carbon and actually start to reverse climate change while we reduce and eliminate rural poverty. How is this possible? Well, it's because these native plants have adapted to areas of the world, the arid and semi-arid areas, in such a way that they have really different type of photosynthesis. The agave, for example, carries out photosynthesis at night, not during the daytime. And so they're very efficient at using water, 26 times more efficient than than alfalfa, for example. And they don't mind if they're densely planted in the presence of trees. This does not stunt their growth like it would stunt the growth of most plants that carry out photosynthesis during the day. So it's an amazing plant. 2 years ago, we had some farmers who pioneered this system come to our organic research farm outside of San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, and they told us it was a workshop on how to make organic compost that they came to. And after the workshop, they came up to us and they said, have you ever heard of fermenting the leaves of agave plants and feeding these to animals as a silage or a fermented forage? And I said, no. I said, when can we come and see your ranch? And they said, next week. And the whole group of us went out there. And as we started to understand the system, we saw that not only is this something you can produce for 5 cents a kilo, this fermented agave forage, but if you add the pods, the bean pods from the mesquite trees, which come out 2 months a year, if you add a certain percentage, 20% is what we do, you actually come up with something with higher protein levels than alfalfa that you can produce for 10 cents a kilo. And you're looking at a system now where all the farmers in Mexico, there's 4 million family farms left in Mexico, but 90% of them are making zero money. And they're holding on to their land out of, persistence and stubbornness and tradition. But they are failing in economic terms, and their children don't want to farm. And that's why so many people migrate to the United States, because they're trying to support their families and survive. This is a game changer, like nothing that I have run into in 50 years of being an advocate for organics and, being a farm manager recently over the last 10 years, as well as an advocate. So the system is amazing. We're seeing now that animals are thriving off this fermented silage, this fermented agave. Sheep, goats, lambs, cows, horses, burros, our chickens and pigs are eating them. And it's a game changer in the dry season, because otherwise you have to buy feed for your animals, or they get really skinny and unhealthy. So this system, if it's going to be scaled up, it's going to need 4 components. It's going to need consumers who want organic and regenerative products. In this case, livestock products, nutritional supplements that come from livestock, bone broth from the bones, people who will buy, if they're going to drink alcoholic beverages, mezcal and tequila that come out of this regenerative system, certain nutritional supplements like inulin that are very, very important. So we need that market demand and consumer understanding, that demand for organic and regenerative. But we also need, we need money coming into this. These farmers, they own their own land, they own their own livestock, but they're cash poor. And a rural family in Mexico averages $5,000 a year is the average income. And this can double, triple, quadruple that. So it's spreading first in Guanajuato, which is right in the center of the country, but we're now getting visits of groups of farmers from 9 of the 32 states in Mexico who all grow agave or have it growing wild in their areas, who all have some kind of nitrogen fixing trees in their environment, and who have the same economic crisis that they're facing. So this, 60% of the land in Mexico is arid or semi-arid, just like around here. 86% of the farmers don't have wells and aren't going to get them. Rural communities are, impoverished, and this is going to make a big change to get us out of that. Now, the carbon sequestration is interesting. On a call the other day with Ben Dobson, who's on the steering committee of Regeneration International. But Ben Dobson is one of the most advanced regenerative grazers I know of. I mean, their 2,500 acre farm in Hudson, New York is a model for how you have biodiverse natural grasses coming back, how you produce grains and hemp organically and regeneratively, and how you do research on these farms. But Ben said out on our call last week, he said, you people up in the desert can sequester more carbon than we can in our most advanced farms in the northeastern United States. That's mind-blowing. If you can think for a minute, if we could get forests growing in the desert, semi-desert areas of the world, the 9 billion acres, what would it do to the balance of carbon in the atmosphere and the balance of carbon in plants and in the ground? Well, a heck of a lot. So this system, we've engaged in a we've been working for the last 6 months with Hudson Carbon out of Hudson, New York, to measure the amount of CO2 that is stored above ground on a continuous basis in this system, in this agave mesquite agroforestry system. We've measured the roots, the stem, the leaves of numerous plants in numerous parts of the country. We've done lab studies of the soil and the carbon content and the different parts of the plant. And our preliminary statistics show, for all of you who are climate nerds like I am, 270 tons of CO2 are sequestered above ground on a continuous basis in this system once it's established. And that is a lot. In Mexico, that means if we deploy this system on 1.1% of farmlands and rangelands, we are going to be able to cancel out all the emissions of the entire country, 1.1%. And when you think about, well, if 60% of the land is like this, and it already has the native species growing, then this is pretty darn exciting. And so our project is called the Billion Agave Project. And we're trying to talk about, mass deployment of this system. But one thing to keep in mind, we already have 1 billion plants, 1 billion agaves growing in Mexico right now. I mean, in the state of Jalisco alone, there's 500 million blue agave plants growing. The problem is the way that they're being grown. They're either growing wild, or else, in the case of the tequila industry, and they're being grown as a monoculture, sort of the way a Midwestern conventional farmer grows soybeans or corn, using pesticides, using chemical fertilizers, with pest problems, and they're not utilizing the full plant. And so I think we've got a regenerative tiger by the tail here, and we're really excited about the potential not only in Mexico and the southwestern United States to deploy this system in conjunction with holistic livestock management, but its global potential. And so here I'll turn it over to Andre Lowe, who previously was the president of IFOAM, the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements, or Organics International, before he came to serve as International Director of Regeneration International. Andre has traveled the world. He's been to more than 100 countries, visiting organic farms and ranches, and he is a fanatic like I am on how regenerative and organic practices can not only mitigate global warming, but how we can actually reverse global warming while we restore ecosystems and really start to eliminate rural poverty and forced migration. So Andre, take it over. Andre's in northern Queensland today at his organic farm, a tropical fruit farm.
Yeah. Thanks, Ronnie. And I really appreciate being able to be at Moses. I hope next year I can be there in person. I've always wanted to speak at Moses, so it's great to do it virtually. So what Ronnie is talking about is probably one of the most significant projects that we can do on the planet at the moment. The arid and semi-arid areas of the planet actually produce around 60% of the world's food. And at the same time, the people who do it are amongst the most impoverished on our planet. And, it's what I will call a violent poverty. And, in this sort of poverty, we really need to change it to make the world a fairer and better place. What is really exciting about this system is that we can also adapt it so that we can work with the native ecosystems. Every one of these ecosystems on their continents have their own nitrogen fixing plants. So, for instance, if we go down to the more southern areas of Mexico and Central America, we can use latinas. When we go down to South America, we can use plants like ingas. We go across to Africa and they have a range of acacias, particularly prickly acacias and sesbanias. And it's the same in Asia and Australia, acacias and sesbanias. And the issue with all these legume trees is that they put out compounds to protect themselves from being grazed. As Ronnie said, you know, they put out saponins and lectins that tend to be toxic. But when you ferment the leaves and the branches of these trees, the fermentation breaks them down and makes them highly nutritious. Also, in some cases, we can talk about plants like prickly acacia from Africa. In Africa, they have animals like rhinos that can eat them, but prickly acacias have been introduced to Asia and to Latin America and to Australia, where they've now become invasive weeds, and because they're prickly, nothing eats them. With these systems, fermentation systems can actually chop them up and ferment them so that even the spines, the prickles, become edible, and we can take something that is an invasive species now and instead of spraying it out with poisons, turn it into a very good stock feed and control it, and at the same time plant out the native systems. So what we can do here is start having agroforestry systems that are based essentially on the native trees, the native grasses, and the one thing that is introduced, it's not even has to be introduced, are the agaves, because the agaves are already growing in all these ecosystems. As Ronnie said, they were introduced more than 100 years ago, originally for fiber, for sisal. But the introduction of nylon and synthetics destroyed that industry, but the agaves are still there. So we can make these new agroforestry systems. The other really important thing about these systems is that most of these arid and semi-arid areas are some of the most degraded areas on the planet because of overgrazing and the wrong grazing systems. The wonderful thing about the agave now is that we and also adding the leaves and branches of the legume trees as fodder, this can now be used as good fodder in the dry season to take the pressure off grazing and overgrazing the land, so we can actually start regenerating these ecosystems and at the same time start producing a lot of valuable animal products. The important thing to remember here too is that 68% of the world's designated agricultural lands are rangelands. They are not suitable for cropping. And when people go into these ecosystems and start to crop them, to plow them up, they cause enormous ecological damage. In fact, they create deserts by doing it. By properly restoring these ecosystems, we can turn these systems around and start bringing back the biodiversity and the endemic native biodiversity. So on this level, it's a very exciting project. The other one, I just want to point out too, how important this is for climate change, is that the work that Hudson Carbon has done has shown that these systems can sequester around 270 kilograms of carbon dioxide, 270 tons, of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, or we just say 270 tons of carbon dioxide it's per acre, isn't it? So, sorry, I'll get it. It's so 270,000 pounds of carbon dioxide per acre per year. That's a better one for people to understand how significant this is. And we just did a back of the envelope figures the other day and looked at if we could just scale this up to just 5% of these arid and semi-arid areas in the world, 5%, we would draw down enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that we would actually be greenhouse gas neutral. We would actually reach net neutrality just by doing that. And talking about scaling up to just 5% of arid and semi-arid lands is a very achievable goal. So this is, in my mind, a really exciting and important project. So I'll hand it back to Ronnie for that.
So how are we going to scale this up? I mean, our idea is that we want to first start scaling this up in Mexico. And one interesting thing about Mexico, very different from the United States, is that the majority of the land in the country, over 50%, is owned by small farmers. And why is that? Well, they have these organizations sort of similar to a co-op. They're called ejidos, and these come out of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and 1920. Basically, Mexico was like most countries in the global South before 1910, where a tiny proportion of the population controlled all the land, and people had been slaves essentially for 400 years. And what happened in 1910 was Mexican people, led by the farmers and the ranchers, got tired of this. And indigenous people, they overthrew the government and they wrote a new constitution. The Constitution of 1917 in Mexico basically said that land belongs to those who farm it, and they divvied up the land of the big haciendas or the big plantations to the rural communities. And there's 28,000 of these ejidos across Mexico with millions of members collectively in these, and they control over 50% of the farmland and ranch land in the country. Now, unfortunately, the Mexican Revolution, like most, never achieved its full potential. And so the land that these ejidos or community cooperatives got title to, and it took 50 years in some cases to get the titles, was the worst land in the country. So a lot of it is this semi-arid, arid land. The landowners, some of the landowners were able to hold on to their territory. They tend to be the people who have access to wells and irrigation and so on. But can you imagine in the US, if small farmers and ranchers owned the majority of the land? It'd be a different situation from what it is now. So anyway, they have the ability to work together as ejidos to take their overgrazed rangeland and take their native plants and start to build these polyculture perennial agroforestry systems right in their communities. And this is what they're going to do, because they all have livestock, but their livestock are suffering in the dry season, which has gotten worse and worse. They're going to be able to use this fermented silage to improve the health of their livestock. They're going to be able to, the nice thing about this system one thing we've brought as the organic movement to Mexico is the idea, if you have a system that's inherently organic, where you're not using any pesticides or chemical fertilizers, where there's no factory farming of these animals. It's grazing based. If you can get your system certified, and we're talking group certification, Mexico has 175,000 certified organic farmers. I mean, 5 times as many as the US, or 6 times as many. But most of them are small organic coffee growers or cacao growers who are organized in these co-ops and through their ejidos. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do group certification for these production units in this agroforestry and livestock management system. And so the nice thing is that the fodder, the fermented agave or agave and mesquite, will be organic. The animals will be raised from birth as organic, so that you'll be able to sell for the first time. There is no organic lamb or sheep for sale in Mexico right now. There's organic beef. Some of our key steering committee people are organic beef producers and grass-fed producers. But we're going to be able to expand the organic beef industry significantly. The other thing we've discovered, partly because it's an international effort down here, is that, the value added products that come out of animal agriculture, for example, are much more profitable in many cases than the meat itself. For example, if you have certified supplements that come out of the certified livestock, like capsules or powders of the heart or liver or kidneys, or the bone broth, if it's certified organic and really is, these are really valuable. The organic beef jerky is valuable. And so we are going to see a tremendous increase in the number of certified organic farmers in Mexico, especially in the livestock sector, which up until now there have been very few. And not only that, we're going to be able to jump over that whole period that we had to go through in the organic movement in the US, because we're going to stress from the beginning, we want our things to be organic and regenerative, and if they're organic and regenerative, you're going to get a better price in the marketplace. You're going to have a healthier product. You're going to have a healthier environment. And so I think this is going to scale up. We've had meetings, believe it or not, with national officials in Mexico City, members of the Morena Party, and some of these people who run the Department of the Environment and, number 2 position in the Department of Agriculture. We've been working with these people for 20 or 30 years against Monsanto and GMOs and for organic. These people are now in power in Mexico. And sort of like Deb Haaland, hopefully will be Secretary of the Interior in the United States, but there's already a similar situation. We're also finding that politicians at the county level, they call them municipios here. There's 2,400 municipios in Mexico, like there's 3,260 counties in the US. We're finding support at the county level. We're finding support at the state government level, even though some of these local and state bureaucrats are, basically criminals, political criminals who don't care that much about, in general, about the campesinos or the small farmers, but they know enough they got to do some things right. They got to greenwash their corruption. And so they're interested as well. And then now we're finding impact investors. I mean, we've heard so much in the United States about, impact investing is going to be the wave of the future. We got $35 trillion in liquid capital flowing around the country. It's all in the stock market now, all invested in degenerative investments. Well, they're going to show up. Well, They haven't yet, in my opinion, but we have found some that get it and that are willing to put serious amounts of money into systems like this that not only can sequester carbon, but can eliminate poverty and forced migration, and that can restore ecosystems. So I think that the lesson for us in the United States is, first of all, we've got huge amounts of arid and semi-arid lands in the Southwest where it's impossible to make a living anymore. I mean, I've talked to traditional Navajo grandmas who raise sheep, in the Navajo Nation, the largest native reservation in the country. They are not making it. They are living in poverty that most Americans can't even imagine. And the climate is coming down on people really strongly in the Southwest, everywhere from West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada. It's becoming very, very, very difficult. Even if you understand organic farming and are practicing it, even if you understand, say, planned rotational grazing, if you don't have enough rain, to get your grass growing, very hard to make a living. So this is going to be a big deal in the United States. And we need to seriously look, now that we've had a regime change in Washington, we're going to have to push these people every step of the way. But think of someone like Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior. We got 500 million acres of public lands in the United States right now. Most of them are degraded. Most of them are, semi-arid, arid areas. Most of them are populated by the poorest people in the United States, indigenous communities and embattled rural communities. I think we can take a great leap forward in the organic movement and the organic and regenerative movement if we will combine our know-how. We've got the farmers and ranchers who have figured out what to do, but we need policy change at the local level, state level, federal level if possible, and we need money. We need serious money. I'm not talking about donations and charitable donations and so on. I'm talking about we need to convince people that their pension funds, that their savings, that the money that's in Wall Street now needs to go instead out directly to the farmers and ranchers and land managers who are going to make a difference. And I think we can do that. Andre, and then we'll open up to any discussion, questions.
Yeah, I suppose what I'd just like to say where this is very important is getting back to the point that globally 68% of agricultural lands are actually rangelands that are not suitable for cropping. They are only suitable for animal husbandry, and that's what they have traditionally been used for. But the animal husbandry has really caused severe environmental degradation. And, if we look at places like Egypt, for instance, that's a man-made desert. Iran, a lot of the areas of the Sahel surrounding the Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, these are deserts created by unsustainable livestock grazing. And with this system, by, I suppose you could say, regreening it, putting in a perennial agroforestry system based on native plants, indigenous plants that are adapted, using, reestablishing the native pastures, and then using holistic grazing to take the pressure off. But very importantly is having the agave as the backstop for the dry season, to take the pressure off overgrazing these systems, which is what is happening. We will restore these systems and also allow the people there who are amongst the poorest on the planet, severely poor, to go into well-being and prosperity. This is really important. And people have to understand is that these people aren't in areas where they can actually grow crops. They can only really use animals. And so what we're enabling them now is to use livestock systems to produce animal products. And the other point we want to make here is that, there's 2 points here. One is that a lot of our livestock production, particularly CAFOs, which are animal concentration camps, are very cruel. It's animal cruelty. And we need to have these systems ended and stopped. But on the other hand, if we can start getting livestock production out in rangelands that in natural conditions for the livestock, where livestock is properly cared for, where this livestock has a good life, they're well looked after, we can start getting humane livestock production. That is very important. The other issue too is that at the moment with our confined animal systems, they are one of the major contributors towards climate change and greenhouse gas output. And so there's a big movement to stop animal production because of this. But what we need to point out is that the systems that we're talking about, instead of being a major contributor towards climate change, will be a major solution. We turn animal production, the confined, cruel animal factories, into these natural systems, natural ecosystems that are now taking out more carbon dioxide, more greenhouse gases than they're putting out. The figures which we wanted to say before of taking out 270,000 pounds of carbon dioxide per acre.
It's actually 540,000 pounds, but
sorry, okay.
There's 2,000 pounds in a ton or 2,200 in the metric, but
okay, thanks, Gary.
Andre's in the metric.
I've been severely underestimating it. So, but what I'm trying to get across here is that these are also really important outcomes. Is that we can change animal production from being inherently cruel and inhumane, and that needs to end, to being humane, which is really important. We can take animal production from being a major contributor to climate change and to being a major solution. We can take animal production, which is a major contributor to environmental degradation, through to a major contributor to regenerating, to ecosystem restoration by using native plants in these systems. And then the other one is we can take some of the poorest people who are living in violent poverty and take them through to well-being. That is a really important outcome. So there are just so many critical, important outcomes in the system. And it's why we need to look at scaling it up to the whole planet, because it can be used for, as I said, 68% of our designated agricultural lands on the planet. Ronnie, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, well, the host has to, take over here to where we can somehow get questions and input from people who are participating in this, and we can answer any questions or, hear what you have to say.
So we do have a question in the chat box here. I'll read it aloud. Mark says, how can the regenerative movement be anything but organic? Conventional ag with conventional pesticides cannot be regenerative. It's not their label. It's built into the organic standards if enforced.
Yes. Andre, you want to answer that?
Happy to answer that, and we fully agree. If it is not organic, it is not regenerative. We actually believe that organic is the fundamental starting point. And so we like to talk about organic and regenerative. But, so where we see some of the other systems at the moment that are talking themselves, trying to promote themselves as regenerative, particularly what conservation agriculture is the word now, which is really Roundup Ready, GMOs, no-till systems. What we'd like to point out, there's a contradiction. You cannot be regenerative if you're using degenerative practices and spraying out, millions of pounds of poisons into the environment and using genetically modified crops is degenerative. So what we need to point out to a lot of these people is that they've actually made a spelling mistake in their title. If they want to, be truthful and truthfully describe what they do, they need to change the R in their agriculture to a D and call themselves degenerative agriculture. And then they're being honest. And we need to point this out. Every time one of these greenwashers say that they're regenerative, they're using pesticides and using degenerative practices, we say, sorry, you've made a spelling mistake. You've got to correct it and call yourself degenerative. And then you're being honest. And that's one of the things that we want to be really strong on. And I'll get back to it. If it's not organic, it cannot be regenerative.
Yeah, I see another question here in the chat. As these agroforestry systems mature, is there the possibility to introduce more crops into the mix? Is there any indication it'll change the nature of the soils and water holding capacity to allow for more plant options? Yeah, I mean, the answer to this, working with Hudson Carbon, what we want to emphasize is that we're talking about ecosystem restoration. We're not just talking about carbon sequestration. What you find in these systems where there's a polyculture, a perennial polyculture, that's connected to animals helping regenerate stuff, is that the soil is getting more biologically alive, more fertile. It holds more water. This system that we're developing, for example, the first stage, as I describe in my paper, Agave Power, Greening the Desert, which you can find on the website of Regeneration International. The first stage is often the ecosystem restoration, where we're using drones and topography mapping to make sure that the agaves that are planted and the trees that are planted, if we have to transplant trees, are in a curve that corresponds to the way the water flows, and that you utilize these check dams and you utilize the terracing to make sure that the rainfall you do get goes into the soil and is retained. So there's no way to do regenerative organic agroforestry system without paying attention to soil health, without paying attention to biodiversity, without paying attention to how you capture the water and store it. Most people in the world don't have wells or irrigation, most farmers and ranchers, and they're not going to get it. So you've got to use these systems. At our research farm, for example, here in San Miguel de Allende, we don't have a well. We have 65 acres, but we utilize capturing the water off roofs and putting it into cisterns, capturing water into ponds or bordeaux, as they're called here. We use the curved rows for everything that we're growing, and we use planned rotational grazing with solar fencing. And so everything has got to be geared to that. In addition, our system is more than just, it's not just agaves and mesquite in our particular case. There are native desert plants, cactuses, nopales, and so on, that we definitely, we want to preserve those. We want to increase the number. We also seed the area with pasture grasses. We're trying to, seed the right ones, the traditional ones, the traditional perennial grasses with the deeper roots. A lot of this knowledge is, it's not widely known anymore. And we use also fava beans, or they're called haba, H-A-B-A in Spanish, as a cover crop. And it's a bean that doesn't require as much water as some of the traditional varieties that people have done here. So yes, we have to be sowing biodiversity and sowing, basically utilizing organic permaculture techniques at every step of the way for this system to be optimum. But we're just lucky that Mother Nature has produced plants like agave in these semi-desert areas and desert areas of the world that have an amazing potential, that have photosynthesis on a level that is hardly able to believe. I mean, some of these plants are, they weigh a ton at 10 years, and you can harvest them, the leaves, throughout that period. So, and nature has also provided us with nitrogen fixing, nutrient fixing trees. I mean, like a mesquite, where I grew up in Texas, I didn't grow up in West Texas, but in West Texas, the mesquite were considered a nuisance. I mean, the idea was you bulldoze them all out, you burn them so that you can graze animals. I mean, somehow people forgot the indigenous knowledge, which is that these leguminous trees, this is incredible food for livestock, and even mesquite flour. Indigenous people were baking with indigenous flour 7,000 years ago, and so we've overlooked a lot of native plants. We've overlooked a lot of indigenous wisdom, and now we can make up for lost time, because Mother Nature is still trying to help us.
Can I just also add to that? One of the things that starting to happen in these systems as we improve them is, in all these arid and semi-arid systems, there are regular rainfalls. In some areas it's winter rain, in some areas it's summer rain. And what is starting to happen now is a concept called pasture cropping, where either cover crops or cash crops can be grown in the perennial pasture without ploughing it out. It's just planting directly into it. So something like fava beans, for instance, are very common. They're an excellent bean for putting nitrogen as a cover crop, but actually they're a very good bean for protein as well, for eatings. And then, other crops like oats. Oats are one of the best that can actually be grown as an annual in these perennial pastures. And the oats can be harvested for people to eat, or used as a green fodder for animals as well. And then sorghum, even in areas where you get a summer rainfall in arid areas, you can grow varieties of corn very well. So there's a lot of options that can be done where we can actually start putting annual crops in these perennial systems, working with the seasons and choosing the right species. The other one I just want to just answered one of the statements in the chat box about how farmers have been using silage for a very long time. And yet silage goes back for thousands of years. These are, you know, being based usually on crops that have been grown or harvested for silage. What is unique about this system is taking essentially native plants, wild plants, and harvesting them and chopping them up into fermenting them as silage. This is, you know, what is different. And by doing that now, it's just opened up a whole world of possibilities. You know, what was previously regarded as inedible now becomes edible simply through fermentation. It just, you know, it opens up a whole new world to us.
Another question in the chat box, you mentioned, it said, Ronnie, you mentioned this system needs money. How do we present this, quote, socialist idea to a capitalist culture? Well, I think that we have to get to the point where we've now gotten in this agave mesquite project, where we come up with a plan that's economically viable, you know, where we have, where we can actually solicit not just grants, which are of course always helpful, but where we can solicit investments to where, I know one of the groups we're working with is Iroquois Valley Farms. And they're a very good group in the United States that helps organic farmers buy farmland and helps them develop their marketing plan and brings them technical assistance in from the best farmers and ranchers to make sure that they succeed. The regeneration movement has to become a little more sophisticated about economics. And for example, the organic and regenerative meat sector, I mean, we've got a lot of good rotational grazers around the world, but most of them aren't making that much money. And one of the reasons why they're not making that much money is that we have to follow the example of someone like New Zealand, where they use every part of the animal to make a viable product. So in the case of, say you're raising organic and regenerative beef, yes, this will command a decent price in the marketplace compared to people who aren't organic and regenerative. But the marketplace is flooded with bogus factory farm bone broth, for example, which sells for a premium. I mean, look at Whole Foods. Near the checkout counter, you see these containers of bone broth that say natural or all natural, but they're just from factory farms. And they're selling for an arm and a leg. And it's impossible for an honest producer to compete with this unless we can get to the point where we have labels that say organic, biodynamic, you know, organic and regenerative, and educate consumers that you don't want to be putting bone broth from a factory farm into your kid's smoothie in the morning. If you see organic on the label, okay. You know, if you see American Grass-Fed Association or whatever tells you that this animal was properly grazed as well as being raised organically, that's one thing. So I think we don't really have any choice. One thing that has changed is that people with money and people with investment money are starting to become alarmed about the climate. They're starting to become alarmed about public health. They're alarmed about a lot of these issues relating to poverty and rural forced migration. And I think we can make a case that you can get a good return, not immediately and not killer profits. You can get a good return by working with organic and regenerative farmers and ranchers and land managers, and that consumers want these products. Most Americans in polls say, I think 57% say they know organic food is superior to chemical food. They already know this. Poor people know this. Middle class people know this. They know organic is better. The problem is that when they pull out their wallets at the grocery store or the farmer's market or the natural food store, there's not much money in there. And so I think we've got to start looking at things that we used to think were utopian. I mean, why don't we provide free food for all kids in school in the United States that's organic and regenerative? Why don't we provide free food for everyone in nursing homes and everyone who's, got Medicare? It's like we would save money on healthcare costs. We would have healthier, happier people. We wouldn't have had the enormous death and devastation from this COVID-19 if people across the board had access to organic food, whether they could afford it or not. And that's the type of socialism that I think Republicans, independents, Democrats will go for. Rural America will go for. The Democrats have to wake up to the fact that rural America voted for Trump, and they voted for Trump because they didn't see that much difference between the Democrats and the Republicans as far as farm and rural policy, and they voted on other issues, And so we've got to bring together people who voted for Trump, people who voted for Biden, people who are independents, and talk about what do we really want. And I think we really want a lot of the same things. We want a healthy environment, a stable climate. We want rural communities that offer a future for the young people. We want healthy people. We want to get rid of this chronic disease epidemic that kills, 8,300 people die every day in the United States on the average, 8,300, and most of these people are dying from chronic diseases that they're dying ahead of their time, from chronic diseases that are related to diet and the environmental pollution, and we can get healthier. America spends $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare, and we're the unhealthiest people in the industrialized world. And the reason for that is that we've had governments, forever that would rather subsidize chemical intensive agriculture and junk food than they would subsidize, organic and grass fed and pastured. And we're going to have the fight of our lives here. To change that. But I think people are ready, and I'm really confident that we can do that.
I wanted to talk on this whole differences that we have. Can you guys hear me?
The differences?
Yeah.
Well, I think I live in northern Minnesota half of the year, and then I live in Mexico half of the year, and I live in rural areas.
Sorry about that.
It's really different. It's really different city rural. That's one of the divisions we can heal. I think one thing urban people have in common with the organic movement is they like the food that we produce. There's a bridge there.
I think we have a lot in common with what you said about our wants as a people. And you know what? I don't associate myself with either Democrat or Republican. I actually just kind of watch people lean over to the left or lean over to the right and just forget that we were just all people here trying to make a life of ourselves. So we became so polarized, and that was a distraction. And a lot of the distractions are here with our televisions and our, the music, all that stuff. And they're really, they're just really pitting us against us. It really comes down to that, as I've learned over time. We're literally being pitted against each other because Democrats don't want to understand the Republicans. Republicans don't really know Democrats. And it's kind of weird because we're talking about the same things. And then some people are defying other policies because the other group is voting differently. It's kind of strange that allowing ourselves to be pushed in those directions because of the propaganda that's coming from the news. Like they're just deciding whether we'll be Democrat or Republican and just promote that to us. So when it comes to like this whole like agriculture thing, it's they're really the way that the system is designed now is that the ones that are at the top, they're so disconnected from us. Clearly, as we've seen through the debates of like the stimulus talks and everything, they're so disconnected from us that they don't see, they don't know what it feels like to be down here, like what we're doing, going to school or working and trying to make food for other people. All they see is the counting of the numbers, and they're talking to each other about, you know, well, what's the data today? What did you guys collect from the department of this and blah blah blah. It's like that's all just numbers to them. They don't know what it really is like to be another actual average person out here. They're so disconnected from us. And so they're pushing all these really, really weird, strange agendas because they're so disconnected from, well, spirit, from us, from like what we are on this planet. To them, they're like a separate entity. And so they treat us that way. Like that's what it comes down to. It's just people that are so disconnected. They're so disconnected. They're making policies on our behalf, which we're not really voting on. But essentially they're pushing for total control, concentration of wealth and power. And we're witnessing it throughout history. It's happened time and time again, where we're just losing our value. We're losing our properties, our rights, our freedoms. I mean, we're so monitored and stuff. And I guess the thought of it is kind of scary.
Thank you. Sorry, we're running a bit over time here, so we'll probably need to wrap up the roundtable pretty shortly. But yeah, thank you for that comment. And I don't know if there's much more time, but
so much for the opportunity.
Could we just thank you. I was just going to say, Ellen's had a hand up, so maybe she wants to ask a question.
Yeah. So my question is, you know, I've done a lot of climate activism over the years, and you know, I always come at it from why are we always thinking about working on transportation, which of course we should. Let's kind of do that backdoor route and heal the stuff with agriculture. And then, whoops, there we are. We've all eaten well and we've solved the problem, and there we go. And, you know, and it's so hard trying to convince some of the climate folks that vegetarian might not be the only solution, and that, you know, this important animal agriculture. Now, I get it if people are making a choice on ethics there, or religious spiritual choice, but I'm just kind of wondering, and I wrote it in the chat, like what is the like 3 or 4 great sentences that I can use as part of the discussion that will really get people to see, or if you can point me to some reading or an article, because I think that will really help. Thank you. And thanks for your brilliant work. I love this stuff.
Well, I think Andre pointed out one point that most of vegans in the United States don't understand, that 68% of the world's farmland is actually rangeland, and it's not suitable for growing crops. Yeah. Okay, and so there's 1 billion people who make a living off that land. And if we abolished animal agriculture, they would all starve, or they have to move to the big cities. And so that's, it's a sort of US-centric or Euro-centric position to take in a way. The second thing is that regenerative and organic advocates, we want to get rid of animal cruelty and factory farms, period. I mean, either we can have factory farms and cheap meat and animal products, or we can have a stable climate and a healthy environment and a healthy public. We can't have both. We got to get rid of factory farms. I think the overwhelming majority of people in the United States do not like these animal prisons, these factory farms. A lot of people just don't understand there is an alternative. There's farmers and ranchers out there right now, making that alternative. And so we need to point out that I think another thing is that we are dependent on the animals, just like the animals are dependent on us. And without the animals, we are not going to be able to restabilize the climate and restore damaged ecosystems. There's no way we can do it. And on the other hand, the animals depend on us to start to realize that they are sentient beings too. They are not animal units. They are not, beings to be just manipulated and so on. When we kill an animal for human purposes, it's sacrifice, just like indigenous people always knew. If we're going to sacrifice the life of an animal so that we humans can survive, we got to make sure that animal had the best life they could, that they were as healthy as could, and that we use every single ounce, of their bodies, for good, and not just treat them like animal units and throw them into factory farms. You kill them, you take the parts you want, the rendering industry comes by and gets the rest and puts the dogs and cats and an animal offal all together and, feeds it back to animals that are herbivores. It's like, so I don't know, Andre, you've probably got more on this, but it's extremely important that we start this conversation. I know Organic Consumers Association has done some panels where we had like 20,000 people watch them, where we had vegan activists and we had regenerative organic grazers, and we started this conversation. I think it's really, we've got the potential to do that.
Yeah, Ellen, you actually raised a really important question, and I think the way to answer it is this: it's not about whether we eat meat or not; it's about our choice, and we should not be eating any meat or animal products from any CAFO system. These really are the Auschwitzes and Belsons, they're death camps for animals. They're cruel, and in this day and age, we should not be treating sentient beings like this. And when we talk about the greenhouse gases and damage to the climate, that's because they have measured it from these systems. So our choice should be zero animal products from these type of systems. On the other hand, with proper regenerative organic animal systems, we can produce, have animals that are raised with care, raised in ecological systems. Because I think the other thing we need to get across, and this is very important, all ecologies have plants and animals. And if we want to set up good agroecological systems, we have to have plants and animals. That's the way nature works. And in the end, we know with the data we've got, and we actually do have papers published on Organic Consumers and also Regeneration International on this, is that regenerative grazing can sequester more carbon dioxide than it emits. In fact, the data we've got is that some of the most effective systems at taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil are properly managed, regenerative and organic grazing systems. So what we need to say in the end is that the only animal products that we eat or we consume come from regenerative organic systems. That is the debate here. If people choose to eat animal products, they should only get them from regenerative and organic systems.
Amen.
Great, well, thank you. I will go ahead and end our live stream now, but hopefully everyone has enjoyed this roundtable and have a good evening. Thanks, Ronnie and Andre.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.